Metropolis by Thea Von Harbou. Chapter 9. The aeroplane, which had carried Joseph away from Metropolis, swam in the golden air of the setting sun, rushing towards it at a tearing speed, as though fastened to the westward sinking ball by metal cords. Joseph sat behind the pilot. From the moment when the aerodrome had sunk below them and the stone mosaic of the great metropolis had paled away into the inscrutable depths, he had not given the least token that he was a human being with the faculty for breathing and moving. The pilot seemed to be taking a pale grey stone, which had the form of a man, with him as freight, and when he once turned round, he looked full into the wide open eyes of this petrified being without meeting a glance or the least sign of consciousness. Nevertheless, Joseph had intercepted the movement of the pilot's head with his brain. Not immediately, not soon, yet the visions of this cautious yet certain and vigilant movement remained in his memory until he at last comprehended it. Then the petrified image seemed to become a human being again, whose breast rose in a long neglected breath, who raised his eyes upwards, looking into the empty greenish blue sky and down again to the earth, which formed a flat round carpet deep down in infinity, and the sun which was rolling westward like a glowing ball. Last of all, however, at the head of the pilot who sat before him, at the airman's cap, which turned necklace into shoulders, filled with a bull-like strength and a forceful calm. The powerful engine of the aeroplane worked in perfect silence, but the air through which the aeroplane tore was filled with a mysterious thunder, as though the dome of heaven were catching up the roaring in the globe and throwing it angrily back again. The aeroplane hovered homelessly above a strange earth, like a bird not able to find its nest. Suddenly, amid the thunder of the air, the pilot heard a voice in his left ear saying almost softly, "Turn back." The head in the airman's cap was about to bend backwards, but at the first attempt to do so, it came in contact with an object of resistance, which rested exactly on the top of his skull. This object of resistance was small, apparently angular, and extraordinarily hard. "Don't move," said the voice in his left ear, which was so soft yet making itself understood through the thunder of the air. "Don't look around either. I have no revolver with me. Had I had one handy, I should probably not be here. What I have in my hand is an implement the name and purpose of which are unknown to me, but it is made of solid steel and quite sufficient to smash in your skull with, should you not obey me immediately. Turn back." The bull-like shoulders under the airman's cap raised themselves in a short, impatient shrug. The glowing ball of the sun touched the horizon with an inexpressibly light, hovering movement. For a few seconds, it seemed to dance along it in a soft, blazing rhythm. The nose of the airplane was turned towards it and did not alter its course by a hand's breadth. "You do not seem to have understood me," said the voice behind the pilot. "Turn back. I wish to return to Metropolis. Do you hear? I must be there before nightfall." "Well?" "Shut your mouth," said the pilot. "For the last time, will you obey or will you not? Sit down and keep quiet back there, damn it all. What do you mean by it?" "You won't obey?" "What the hell?" A young girl, turning the hay in a wide, undulating field by the last light of the setting sun, had sighted the rushing bird above her in the evening sky and was watching it with eyes heated by work and tired by the summer. How strangely the aeroplane was rising and falling. It was making jumps like a horse that wants to shake off its rider. Now it was racing towards the sun. Now it was turning its back upon it. The young girl had never seen so wild and unruly a creature in the air before. Now it had swung westward, and it was dashing in long, spurting bounds across the sky. Something freed itself from it, a broad, silver-grey cloth which swelled itself out. Drifted hither and thither by the wind, the silver-grey cloth fluttered down to earth, in the webs of which a gigantic black spider seemed to be hanging. Screaming, the young girl began to run. The great black spider spun itself lower and lower on thin cords. Now it was already like a human being, a white, death-like face bent earthwards. The earth curved itself gently towards the sinking creature. The man let go of the cord and leapt and fell, picked himself up again, and fell once more. Like a snow cloud, gentle and shimmering, the silver-grey cloth sank over him, quite covering him. The young girl came running up. She was still screaming, wordlessly, breathlessly, as though these primitive shrieks were her actual language. She bundled the silver silken cloth up before her young breast with both arms in order to bring the man who lay beneath it into the light again. Yes, he lay there now, stretched out at his length on his back, and the silk, which was so strong as to have borne him, tore under the grip of his fingers. And where his fingers lost hold of the silk to find another patch which they could tear, there remained moist red marks upon the stuff, such as are left by an animal that has dipped its paws into the blood of its enemies. The girl was silenced by the sight of these marks. An expression of horror came into her face, but at the same time an expression such as mother beasts have when they scent an enemy and do not want to betray themselves nor their offspring in any way. She clenched her teeth together so forcibly that her young mouth became quite pale and thin. She knelt down beside the young man and lifted his head into her lap. The eyes opened in the white face which she was holding. They stared into the eyes which were bending over them. They glanced sidewards and searched across the sky. A rushing black point in the scarlet of the westerly sky from which the sun had sunk. The aeroplane. Now it had indeed carried out its will and was flying towards the sun, further and further westward. At its wheel sat the man who would not turn back, as dead as could be. The airman's cap hung down in shreds from the gaping skull, on it to the bull-like shoulders. But the fists had not lost hold of the wheel, they still held it fast. Farewell, pilot. The face which lay in the young girl's lap began to smile, began to ask, "Where is the nearest town?" There was no town, far and wide. Where was the nearest railway? There was no railway, far and wide. Joseph pushed himself up. He looked about him. Stretching out far and wide were fields and meadows hemmed in by forests, standing there in their evening stillness. The scarlet of the sky had faded away. The crickets chirped. The mist above the distant solitary willows brewed milky white. From the hallowed purity of the great sky, the first star appeared, with still glimmer. "I must go," said the man with the white death-like face. "You must rest first," said the young girl. The man's eyes looked up at her in astonishment. Her clear face, with its low, unintelligent brow and its beautiful, foolish mouth, stood out as if under a dome of sapphire against the sky which curved above her. "Aren't you afraid of me?" asked the man. "No," said the young girl. The head of the man fell into her lap. She bent forward and covered up the shivering body with the billowing silver silk. "Rest," said the man with a sigh. She made no reply. She sat quite motionless. "Will you awaken me?" asked the man, and his voice quavered with weariness. "As soon as the sun comes?" "Yes," said the young girl. "Keep quiet." He sighed deeply, then he lay still. It grew darker and darker. In the far distance a voice was to be heard, calling a name. long, drawn out again and again. The stars stood glorious above the world. The distant voice was silent. The young girl looked down upon the man whose head lay in her lap. In her eyes was the never-sleeping watchfulness which one sees in the eyes of animals and of mothers. Chapter 10. Whenever Joseph tried, during the days which followed, to break through the barrier which was drawn around Freda, there was always a strange person there, and always a different one, who said with expressionless mien, "Mr. Freda cannot receive anybody. Mr. Freda is ill." But Freda was not ill, at least not as illness generally manifests itself amongst mankind. From morning until evening, from evening until morning, Joseph watched the house, the crown of the tower of which was Freda's flat. He never saw Freda leave the house, but for hours at a time he saw, during the night, behind the white-veiled windows which ran the breadth of the wall, a shadow wandering up and down, and saw at the hour of twilight, when the roofs of Metropolis still shone, bathed in the sun, and the darkness of the ravines of its streets was flooded out by streams of cold light, the same shadow, a motionless form, standing on the narrow balcony which ran around this, almost the highest house in Metropolis. Yet what was expressed by the shadows wandering up and down, by the motionless standing still of the shadow form, was not illness. It was uttermost helplessness. Lying on the roof of the house, which was opposite Freda's flat, Joseph watched the man who had chosen him as friend and brother, whom he had betrayed and to whom he had returned. He could not discern his face, but he read from the pale patch which this face was in the setting sun, in the shower bath of the searchlight, that the man over there, whose eyes were staring across Metropolis, did not see Metropolis. Sometimes people would emerge beside him, would speak to him expecting an answer, but the answer never came. Then the people would go, crushed. Once Joe Fredison came to his son, who stood on the narrow balcony, seeming not to know that his father was near. Joe Fredison spoke to him for a long time. He laid his hand on his son's hand, which was resting on the railing. The mouth received no answer. The hands received no answer. Only once did Freda turn his head, then with difficulty, as though the joints of his neck were rusted. He looked at Joe Fredison. Joe Fredison went. And when his father had gone, Freda turned his head back again on idle joints and stared out once more across Metropolis, which was dancing in a whirl of light, staring with blind eyes. The railing of the narrow balcony on which he stood appeared as an inseparable wall of loneliness, of deep inward consciousness of having been deserted. No calling, no signalling, not even the loudest of sounds penetrated this wall, which was washed about by strong, lustrous surf of the great Metropolis. But Joseph did not want to have ventured the leap from heaven to earth, to have sent a man who was but performing his duty into infinity, impotently to make a halt before this wall of loneliness. There came a night which hung, glowing and vaporous, over Metropolis. A thunderstorm, which was still distant, burnt its warning fires in deep clouds. All the lights of the great Metropolis seemed more wildly to lavish themselves on the darkness. Freda stood by the railing of the narrow balcony, his hot hands laid on the railing. A sultry, uneasy puff of wind tugged at him, making the white silk which covered his now much emaciated body to flutter. Around the ridge of the roof of the house, right opposite there, ran a shining border, a shining word, running in an everlasting circuit around, behind itself. Fantasis. 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 Freda did not see this row of words. The retina received it, not the brain. Eternal hammering, similarity of the wandering word. Fantasis. 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 Suddenly the word picture was extinguished, and in its place numbers sparkled out of the darkness, disappearing again, again emerging, and this coming and disappearing, coming again and again disappearing, and coming anew, had the effect on its unmistakability of a penetrating, persistent call. 97, 7. 97, 7. 97, 7. Freda's eyes caught the numbers. 97, 7. They turned around. They came back again. 97, 7. Thoughts stumbled through his brain. 90 and 7? A second 7? What did that mean? How obtrusive these numbers were. 97, 7. 97, 7. 97, 7. Freda closed his eyes, but now the numbers were within him. He saw them flame up, sparkle, go out. Flame up, sparkle, go out. Was that no or yes? Did not those numbers some time ago, what seemed to him an immeasurably long period ago, also convey something to him? 99, 90. Suddenly a voice in his head said, 90th block. 90th block. House 7, 7th floor. Freda opened his eyes. Over there, on the house just opposite, the numbers jerked up, asked and called. 97, 7. Freda bent forward over the railing so that it seemed he must hurtle into space. The numbers dazzled him. He made a movement with his arm as though he wanted to cover them up or put them out. They went out. The shining border went out. The house stood in gloom. Only half of its height washed around by the shimmer from the white street. The stormy sky, becoming suddenly visible, lay upon its roof, and lightning seemed to be crackling. In the faded light over there stood a man. Freda stepped back from the railing. He raised both hands before his mouth. He looked to the right, to the left. He raised both hands. He raised both arms. Then he turned away as if removed by a natural power from the spot on which he stood, ran into the house, ran through the room, stopped still again. Carefully now, he reflected. He pressed his head between his fists. Was there among his servants one single soul who could be trusted not to betray him to Slim? What a miserable state! What a miserable state! But what alternative had he to the leap in the dark, the blind trust, the ultimate test of confidence? He would have liked to extinguish the lights in his room, but he did not dare to, for up to this day he had not been able to bear darkness about him. He paced up and down. He felt the perspiration on his forehead and the trembling of his joints. He could not calculate the time which elapsed. The blood roared in his veins like a cataract. The first flash of lightning flickered over Metropolis, and in the tardy responding rumble of thunder, the rushing of the rain at last mixed itself soothingly. It swallowed up the sound of the opening of the door. When Freda turned around, Josephat was standing in the middle of the room. He was dressed in workman's uniform. They walked up to each other as though driven by an outward power, but halfway they both stopped and looked at each other, and each had for the other the same horrified question on his face. Where have you been since I saw you last? To what hell have you descended? Freda, with his feverish haste, was the first to collect himself. He seized his friend by the arm. "Sit down," he said in his toneless voice, which occasionally held the morbid dryness of things burnt. He sat down beside him, not taking his hand from the arm. "You waited for me. In vain, and in vain I could not send you a message. Forgive me." "I have nothing to forgive you, Mr. Freda," said Joseph quietly. "I did not wait for you. On the evening on which I was to have waited for you, I was far, far away from Metropolis and from you." Freda's waiting eyes looked at him. "I betrayed you, Mr. Freda," said Joseph. Freda smiled, but Joseph's eyes extinguished his smile. "I betrayed you, Mr. Freda," repeated the man. "Slim came to me. He offered me much money, but I only laughed. I threw it at his head. But then he laid on the table a slip with your father's signature. You must believe me, Mr. Freda. He would never have caught me with the money. There is no sum of money for which I would have sold you, but when I saw your father's handwriting, I still put up a fight. I would gladly have throttled him, but I had no more strength. Joe Fredison was written on the slip. I had no more strength than—" "I can understand that," said Joe Fredison's son. "Thank you. I was to go away from Metropolis, right far away. I flew. The pilot was a strange man. We kept flying straight towards the sun. The sun was setting. Then it occurred to my empty brain that now the hour would come in which I was to wait for you, and I should not be there when you came. I wanted to turn back. I asked the pilot. He wouldn't. He wanted to carry me away by force, farther and farther from Metropolis. He was as obstinate as only a man can be when he knows Slim's will to be behind him. I begged and I threatened, but nothing was of any use. So then, with one of his own tools, I smashed his skull." Freda's fingers, which were still resting on Joseph's arms, tightened their hold a little, but they lay still again immediately. "Then I jumped out, and I was so far from Metropolis that a young girl who picked me up at the field did not know the great Metropolis even by name. I came here, and I found no message from you, and all that I found out was that you were ill." He hesitated and was silent, looking at Freda. "I am not ill," said Freda, looking straight ahead. He loosened his fingers from Joseph's arm and bent forward, laying the palms of both hands flat on his head. He spoke into a space. "But do you believe, Joseph, that I am mad?" "No." "But I must be," said Freda, and he shrank together so narrow that it seemed as if a little boy, filled with a mighty fear, was sitting in his place. His voice sounded suddenly quite high and thin, and something in it brought the water to Joseph's eyes. Joseph stretched out his hand, fumbled and found Freda's shoulder. His hand closed around his neck and drew him gently towards him, holding him still and fast. "Just tell me about it, Mr. Freda," he said. "I do not think there are many things which seem inseparable to me since I sprang, as though from heaven to earth, from the aeroplane which was steered by a dead man. Also," he continued in a soft voice, "I learnt in one single night that one can bear very much when one has someone near one who keeps watch, asks nothing, and is simply there." "I am mad, Joseph," said Freda, "but I don't know if it's any consolation. I am not the only one." Joseph was silent. His patient hand lay motionless on Freda's shoulder. And suddenly, as though his soul were an overfilled vessel which had lost its balance, toppled over and poured out in streams, Freda began to speak. He told his friend the story of Maria, from the moment of their first meeting in the Club of Suns, to when they saw each other again right down under the earth, in the city of the dead, his waiting for her in the cathedral, his experiences in Rotwang's house, his vain search, the curtain no at Maria's home, up until the moment when, for her sake, he wanted to be the murderer of his own father. No, not for her sake, for that of a being who was not there, whom he only believed himself to see. Was that not madness? Hallucination, Mr. Freda. Hallucination? I will tell you some more about hallucination, Josephat, and you mustn't believe that I am speaking in delirium or that I am not fully master of my thoughts. I wanted to kill my father. It was not my fault that the attempt at parricide was unsuccessful. But even since that moment I have not been human. I am a creature that has no feet, no hands, and hardly a head. And this head is only there eternally to think that I wanted to kill my own father. Do you believe that I shall ever get free from this hell? Never, Josephat, never, never in all eternity. I lay down during the night hearing my father walking up and down in the next room. I lay in the depths of a black pit, but my thoughts ran along behind my father's steps as though chained to his soul. What horror has come upon the world that this could happen? Is there a comet in the heavens which drives mankind to madness? Is it a fresh plague coming, or Antichrist, or the end of the world? A woman who does not exist forces herself between father and son and incites the son to murder against the father. It may be that my thoughts were running themselves a little hot at that time. Then my father came into me. He stopped, and his wasted hands twisted themselves together upon his damp hair. You know my father. There are many in the great Metropolis who do not believe Joe Fredison to be human, because he seems to not need to eat and drink, and he sleeps when he wishes to, and usually he does not wish to. They call him the brain of Metropolis. And if it is true that fear is the source of all religion, then the brain of Metropolis is not very far off from becoming a deity. This man who is my father came up to my bed. He walked on tiptoe, Josephat. He bent over me and held his breath. My eyes were shut. I lay quite still, and it seemed to me as though my father must hear my soul crying within me. Then I loved him more than anything on earth, but if my life had been dependent upon it, I should not have been able to open my eyes. I felt my father's hand smoothing my pillow. Then he went again as he had come on tiptoe, closing the door quite soundlessly behind him. Do you know what he had done? No. No, I don't see how you could. I only realized it myself some hours later. For the first time since the great Metropolis had stood, Joe Fredison had omitted to press on the little blue metal plate and to let the beer-mouthed voice of Metropolis roar out, because he did not wish to disturb his son's sleep. Josephat lowered his head. He said nothing. Freda let his intertwined hands sink. Then I realized, he continued, that my father had quite forgiven me, and when I realized that, I really fell asleep. He stood up and remained standing, seeming to be listening to the rushing of the rain. The lightning was still flashing over Metropolis, the angry thunder bounding after, but the rushing of the rain drowned it. I slept, Freda went on, so softly that the other could scarcely follow his words. Then I began to dream. I saw this city, this great Metropolis, in the light of a ghostly unreality. A weird moon stood in the sky as though along a broad street. This ghostly, unreal light flowed down upon the city, which was deserted to the last soul. All the houses were distorted and had faces. They squinted evilly and spitefully down at me, for I was walking deep down between them along the glimmering street. Quite narrow was this street, as though crushed between the houses. It was as though made of a greenish glass, like a solidified glazed river. I glided along it and looked down through it into the cold bubbling of a subterranean fire. I did not know my destination, but I knew I had one, and went very fast in order to reach it minutes, the sooner. I quietened my step as well as I could, but its sounds was exceedingly and excessively loud, and awakened a rustling whisper over the crooked house walls, as though the houses were murmuring against me. I quickened my pace and ran, and at last raced along, and the more swiftly I raced, the more hoarsely did the echoes of the steps sound after me, as though there were an army at my heels. I was dripping with sweat. The town was alive. The houses were alive. Their open mouths snarled after me. The window caverns' open eyes winked blindly, horribly, maliciously. Graspingly, I reached the square before the cathedral. The cathedral was lighted up. The doors stood open. No, they did not stand open. They reeled to and fro like swing doors, through which an invisible stream of guests were passing. The organ rolled, but not with music. Croaking, bawling, screeching, and whimpering sounded from the organ, and intermingled were wanton dance tunes, wailing whore songs. The swing doors, the light, the organ, witches' Sabbath, everything appeared to be mysteriously excited, hurried, as though there were no time to be lost, and full of a deep, evil satisfaction. I walked over to the cathedral and up the steps. A door laid hold of me like an arm and wafted me gustily into the cathedral, but that was as little the cathedral as the town was Metropolis. A pack of lunatics seemed to have taken possession of it, and not even human beings at that. Dwarf-like creatures resembling half monkey, half devil. In place of the saints, goat-like figures, petrified in the most ridiculous of leaps, reined in the pillar niches, and around every pillar danced a ring, raving to the bawling of the music. Empty, ungodded, splintered hung the crucifix above the high altar from which the holy vessels had vanished. A fellow, dressed in black, the caricature of a monk, stood in the pulpit, howling out in a pulpit voice, "Repent! The kingdom of heaven is at hand!" A loud neigh answered him. The organ player, I saw him. He was a demon, stood with his hands and feet on the keys, and his head beat time to the ring dance of the spirits. The fellow in the pulpit pulled out a book, an enormous black book with 7 locks. Whenever his fingers touched a lock, it sprang up in flame and shot open. Murmuring incantations, he opened the cover. He bent over the book. A ring of flame suddenly stood around his head. From the heights of the cathedral it struck midnight, but it was as though it was not enough for the clock to proclaim the hour of demons just once. Over and over again did it strike the ghastly 12 in dreadful bated haste. The light in the cathedral changed colour. Were it possible to speak of a blackish light, this would be the expression best applied to the light. Only in one place did it shine, white, gleaming, cutting a sharply whetted sword, there where death is figured as a minstrel. Suddenly the organ stopped, and suddenly the dance. The voice of the preacher, fellow in the pulpit, stopped, and through the silence, which did not dare to breathe, rang the sound of a flute. Death was playing. The minstrel was playing the song which nobody plays after him on his flute, which was a human bone. The ghostly minstrel stepped out from out his side niche, carved in wood, in hat and wide cloak, scythe on shoulder, the hourglass dangling from his girdle. Playing his flute, he stepped out of his niche and made his way through the cathedral, and behind him came the 7 deadly sins as the following of death. Death performed a circle around every pillar. Louder and even louder rang the sound of his flute. The 7 deadly sins seized his hands. As a widely swung chain, they paced behind death, and gradually their paces became a light dance. The 7 deadly sins danced along behind death, who was playing the flute. Then the cathedral was filled with a light which seemed to be made from rose leaves. An inexpressibly sweet, overpowering perfume hovered up like incense between the pillars. The light grew stronger, and it seemed to ring. Pale red lightning flashed from the heights, collecting itself in the central nave to the magnificent radiance of a crown. The crown rested on the head of a woman, and the woman was sitting upon a scarlet-coloured beast, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet and decked with gold, precious stones and pearls. She had in her hand a golden cup, and on the crowned brow of the woman there stood mysteriously written, Babylon. Like a deity she grew up and radiated. Death and the 7 deadly sins bowed low before her, and the woman who bore the name Babylon had the features of Maria, whom I loved. The woman arose. She touched the cross-arched vault of the lofty cathedral with her crown. She seized the hem of her cloak and opened it and spread out her cloak with both hands. Then one saw that the golden cloak was embroidered with the images of manifold demons, beings with women's bodies and snakes' heads, beings half bull, half angel, devils adorned with crowns, human-faced lions. The flute song of death was silenced, but the fellow in the pulpit raised his yelling voice, "Repent, the kingdom of heaven is at hand." The church clock was still hammering the wild 12th time of midnight. The woman looked death in the face. She opened her mouth. She said to death, "Go." Then death hung the flute on his girdle by the hourglass, took the scythe down from his shoulder and went. He went through the cathedral and went out of the cathedral, and from the cloak of the great Babylon the demons freed themselves, come to life, and flew after death. Death went down the steps of the cathedral into the town. Blackbirds with human faces rustled around him. He raised his scythe as if indicating the way. Then they divided themselves and swooped apart, the broad wings darkening the moon. Death flung back his wide cloak. He stretched himself up and grew. He grew much taller even than the house of Metropolis. The highest hardly reached to his knee. Death swung his scythe and made a whistling cut. The earth and all the stars quivered, but the scythe did not seem to be sharp enough for him. He looked about him as though seeking a seat. The new Tower of Babel seemed to suit Death. He sat down on the new Tower of Babel, propped up the scythe, took the wet stone from his girdle, spat on it, and began to wet the scythe. Blue sparks flew out of the steel. Then Death arose and made a second blow. A rain of stars poured down from the sky. Death nodded with satisfaction, turned around, and set off on his way through the great metropolis. End of part 9. If you are enjoying these audiobooks, please take the time to subscribe, press like, leave a comment, or share this channel with your friends who also enjoy listening to audiobooks. This would help this channel immensely. Thanks.